Well, South Africa's government says it's doing its best to deal with attacks on foreign nationals. Officials say xenophobia is not to blame. Instead, they're pointing fingers at criminals working within communities. We hit the streets to find out what South Africans think of the situation.
Abantu abuya ngaphandle bayeza labasebenze babeke amatafula emakhoneni abantu balamizasi babona kahle ukuthi kubeka itafula ekhoneni abantu bazothini bazomhleka so inkinga le abafuna ukusebenza bafuna ukusebenza ema-ofisini kanti awazi ukuthi ibhizinisi encane iyakhula kube yinto enkulu.
The government has to control the borders, you understand? So if people comes in, they must come in a proper way and all that stuff. So, and we as South Africans, we need to know that those are people also. They are human beings. Okay, they run away from their countries because it's bad there. You understand? Maybe tomorrow I'll also run away from South Africa and go somewhere.
So repeat ka hore ke batho ba ka kontle kante le bana ba rona ba temo.
So it just shows in our nature how really we are not really Afrocentric as we claim to be.
I mean, it's violence against humanity, you know. So we should treat it as such and stop saying, no, it's now Afrophobia and what. Those guys, what they're doing, it's criminal. We cannot put Africa in the name of a criminal act, you know.
Well, some Malawian nationals are opting to head home after several attacks in Durban. Let's get some perspective. Joining me now, political and social commentator Mighti Jamie. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Looking back on the past 2 decades, I tend to think of Thabo Mbeki and that famous speech, I am an African. When you reflect on the latest attacks in KwaZulu-Natal, that seems a lifetime ago.
Well, there's always been a discrepancy between the political rhetoric around Pan-Africanism and the expressions of that on the ground. So we've seen a lot of Afrophobia manifesting itself in South Africa over the last 10 years, so to speak. And so there is a bit of a gap between where Mbeki's ideals were and what we actually see on the ground. Lots of tension, lots of negative sentiment, lots of violence that sparks out here and again. And being an election season, this kind of a thing was actually inevitable.
Mighty, we keep hearing this phrase, criminality, 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 but are we not missing a trick here? Isn't the real issue social economic circumstance? Because we tend to see these attacks in areas which are very often impoverished. Is that not what is squeezing out this xenophobic sentiment in these areas?
So I think it's important to recognize that xenophobia and xenophobic attacks are criminal. So saying it's criminality, like what the minister has said, and maybe Cyril Ramaphosa as well, I'm talking about Lindiwe Sisulu, is inaccurate. Let's call it for what it is. It's a xenophobic sentiment that expressed itself through violence. Now the question is, does economic inequality in townships and other communities where there's poverty create violent attacks? Not really, right? There are wealthy people in townships, right? These particular attacks, even though there is the language of economy around them, are directed particularly at these foreign-owned shops and at the foreign nationals. So the narrative that it's just the affluent or the successful foreigners who are living in townships isn't quite fully accurate. It doesn't fully address the fact that there is resentment that is spread sometimes by community leaders, sometimes by politicians, which makes African foreigners in particular the other, which is very weird considering how we were not divided along these lines before the scramble for Africa and before the kind of computations that we saw through colonialism.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you would have heard Lindiwe Sisulu and, of course, Bheki Cele, the police minister, issuing some statements, meeting with African officials earlier this week. What did you make of what they had to say, and what would you have said if you were in their position?
So I think it's important that they did meet with the foreign ambassadors to assuage their fears, to let them know that the government is not going to tolerate this kind of activity. The ANC, to be fair to them, has always cracked down in communities where xenophobia manifests itself. The problem is the ANC hasn't been very good at dealing with some of the drivers of the influx of migration. So the ANC, for example, has been very, very soft on Mnangagwa. They were very, very soft on Mugabe, and as a result of that, they allowed the situation in Zimbabwe to decay, and that's what contributed to the influx of Zimbabweans in particular. And the same is true of other regional conflicts and regional problems we've had. The South African ANC government hasn't always been very good at mitigating the push factors for population influx from other regions of Africa.
I want to broaden the scope very quickly, Mighti, and focus on global politics at large and get your sense on what we're seeing in the United Kingdom when it comes to immigration, what we're seeing in the United States when it comes to the so-called wall and immigration. Are we seeing a surge in nationalism on our own continent as those forces are at play in the Northern Hemisphere?
It's very strange because the so-called populist leaders in South Africa, the EFF, they're very welcoming to immigrants. So there's a bit of a discrepancy in that kind of analysis in terms of like what's happening in the EU, what's happening in the US. When you compare it to the so-called populists in South Africa, the EFF has been very welcoming. They've actually said we're all Zimbabweans, we're all Nigerians. So there's a bit of a discrepancy there. But in terms of the mega trend, we are seeing that places where nationalism is manifesting also oftentimes go along with places where xenophobia rises and sentiments of the other become very vitriolic and become very negative, leading to attacks in many instances, or leading to the kind of rhetoric we've seen from Trump, we've seen in the UK specifically.
Some important insights. Thanks so much. That's Mighti Jamie exploring the implications of those attacks on foreign nationals. After the break, Pope Francis makes an historic trip to Morocco, a country dominated by Islam. Plus, the top destinations for young African professionals who are immigrating. More on that in a moment.